Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Andy Verity. I'm a BBC correspondent for my sins. Closer here, yeah. For my sins, I'm a BBC correspondent. I report on economics and I also do financial investigations. Very interested in progressive economics. Always have been, and all sides of the debate, actually. But I just want to talk very briefly before I get to Professor Danny Dorling about the situation we're in at the moment. We're here to talk about progressive economics, and it can sometimes seem that progress is, well, all hope of it seems to fade. You spend 5 years under the Tories hoping that a Labour government might get in and do something progressive, and then a Labour government gets in. It appears to support what a lot of people regard as a genocide in Gaza, and it also appears to want to balance the books off the backs of people claiming disability and incapacity benefit, as opposed to on the sort of assumption without proof that there's lots of fraud going on. Whereas the same assumptions are not applied, for example, to tax avoiders, tax evaders, where you might equally recoup 5 billion a year. So it can sometimes seem that progress is impossible, but we know it is possible. And we know that because of two things: history and geography. We know because of our own country's past that progress is possible. And we know because of what goes on in other countries that it doesn't necessarily have to be as unequal as it is. Now, my interviewee today, you've already heard from him if you've been here before, but Professor Danny Dorling is an expert, one of the country's leading authorities on inequality. He points out in his book, which I've been reading on the way up here, called Shattered Nation, that in Europe, there's only one state which is more unequal than we are, and that's Bulgaria. But he can also make the comparisons between us and the rest of the world, other equally unequal states, and states that have managed to demonstrate to us that it is possible for things to be different. It doesn't have to be like this. So Danny Dorling, Professor of Geography, St Peter's College, Oxford. He's one of the country's leading experts on inequality, mapping out who's got the most and the least in the world on an innovation called worldmapper.org, writing and editing more than 50 books, which he describes as a bit of an addiction, including studies of some of the most unequal countries in the West, including our own. Shattered Nation, Inequality and the Geography of a Failing State is one. Last year, Peak Injustice, Solving Britain's Inequality Crisis was another. Danny, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the academic post you've occupied since 2013, I think it is titled 1971 Professor of Geography at the School of Geography and the Environment at University of Oxford, because that's, I understand, the year that they started funding that post. But it has interesting resonances as well. I think you were born in 1968, so you were 3 when that was funded. I was 2. And lots of people in this room will remember the 70s and 80s. I don't know if I'm idealizing it, but I sometimes think that that was a more coherent, kinder society than the one that emerged as I became an adult and over the last 30 years. Between 1945 and 1975, we know there was, in a way, something that we took for granted until recently, until the last 20 years of flagging living standards, of falling real incomes. Progressives were pretty self-confident. They thought that they could rely on real incomes progressing, on people gradually being able to purchase more and more with each year that went by. And that was also part of what bound people in to feel like they were part of things. If you feel that you can get better off each year, then you can sign up to that. It's much harder to sign up to something where there's been no increase in real incomes for the last 20 years, except for the privileged few at the top. So I'd like to start by taking that as a reference point, Danny. The 1970s, what does the 1970s tell us about how things could be, because they have been?
Yeah, it's my favourite decade. It's the 1970s. I want to write a tribute book to Dominic Sandbrook on Dominic, because you were not there, because you were too young. The decade that actually is not the one you described, about the 70s. The name of my job was very kindly altered by my employer on Valentine's Day this year. So it was named after a murderer who liked torturing people. And my employer decided that might be a bad idea. They had to come up with a new name. And until Ryanair, whoever it is, decide to offer some money to the University of Oxford, and I become the Ryanair Professor of Geography, I will be the 1971 professor. The 1970s, the early 1970s, 71 and 1974 were our peaks of equality, just simply measured as the income gaps between people had never been as low since, if you're very academic about this, some point in very early farming 10,000 years ago or something, right? It's ridiculous when you look at the historical series and realize it wasn't that we were always unequal in the past. It went up and down a little bit. But there was nothing like the 1970s for the gaps between people being so low. It wasn't recognized. So you can read articles in the New Left Review of Books. There's a favourite one in 1968 talking about how terrible the situation is because they didn't use a single statistic. They just assumed it's terrible. But if you measured it, then the gap was low. Life expectancy in a city like Sheffield in 71 was better than the national average. We were that equal. In the early 1970s, and this is very rare, the population centre of Britain began to move northwards. Right? It never moves north, it moves south. In the 30s, it moved dramatically south. People got on their bikes and went for work. And in the 80s, it moved south. The Alvita same pet, really fast. In the early 70s, the population centre moved northwards. The health inequalities were the lowest they'd ever been. And the majority of counties by the early 1970s had gone comprehensive in terms of education. London was building social housing at a faster rate than it had ever done. The rest of the country had built its social housing earlier. The majority of people had holidays. Most of those holidays were in England. They involved caravans or camping. There was the least difference in people's personal behaviour. If you're a banker, you might drive your caravan to the south of France. It would still be a caravan. The highest paid people were doctors. They made up the 1%.
Okay, so I'm now going to interrupt, and I'm going to do an impression of a very biased BBC presenter, or perhaps Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph. The 1970s were a dreadful decade. I don't know what you're talking about. There were strikes all over the place. People didn't collect the bins. There was a 3-day week when we had to use candlelight because the miners were on strike. It was rampant runaway inflation. Everybody was getting worse off.
Yeah, I actually set light to my brother's teddy because there were matches everywhere. And I still got the smell of paraffin. I mean, it was a bit dangerous. There were a lot of strikes, nothing like 1920s. ONS do a strike series of how many million days are lost to strikes. The 20s, even forgetting 1926, were much bigger. But there were a lot of strikes. We had very few strikes from 1945 until the early 70s. But that's because people were striking for something. The miners won their strike. The strikes of the early 1970s meant that pay went up. So in most years, pay rose by more than inflation. Right? Can you imagine you have really high inflation, but your pay rises by more than it? So what's the inflation doing? It's eating into the wealth of the rich. The remaining wealth of the rich is they're losing 20% of their wealth every year. It was, not planned, but certainly not bad. The cockiness of people, you've got to think about the music, think about the chopper bikes, think about the looking people in the eye, think about how nervous the upper classes were at this point. They're on the edge of losing it. This country could well change, become like a normal European country. The class system could have ended. We were in 10 years of that judge saying, is this a book you would like your wife and servants to read? And the jury laughing and going, yes. Right? And the 70s were a continuation of that. And partly because of that, a fight began backwards.
Inflation got up to 23%.
Doesn't matter if your wages go up 24%. But I'm not generally in favour. But people's wages most years went up more. So by the end of the 70s, people were better off than the beginning. Right? But we did have 1 million unemployed. Last time we had that low. There obviously were things that were bad in the 70s. The worst thing was racism. Right? Constant stabbing of Pakistani boys in parks. Right? That's my murders. Right? So, obviously there were very, very bad things in the 70s. But it's not that we had become more racist. It's that we hadn't yet got to the point we're at now, where in polite society, if you're racist, people will shun you. It was okay still to be racist in the 70s. It was okay to give somebody a kicking in the toilets if you thought they were gay, right? It was okay to put your hand up a woman's skirt and you get away with it in the 1970s. So that's not perfect. It was just a moment when a whole set of things had been won and more things could have been won and some things became more progressive. And not everything became worse after the 70s, right? The right to be gay was won. The battle against racism progressed in a way we would have never have believed. You joined the police in my city of Oxford in the 1970s if you wanted to beat up black people, because the pay was so low, there was no other reason you joined the police, right? The police were racist in Oxford. Recently, an Afro-Caribbean police officer told me, "Sir, I think you should go indoors. You're a bit old," and couldn't understand why I was grinning from ear to ear that Thames Valley police are now not always white, right? So some things were worse in the 70s.
Okay, so compare that with now. You were saying that although inflation was high, because wages grew by more, living standards still improved throughout most of the 70s. True. 2005 to 2025, living standards have overall fallen. We're no longer better off than we were in 2005. In fact, the younger generation of workers aren't used to the idea that you're supposed to have a real terms pay rise each year. I remember when I started work in the late 80s, early 90s, real terms pay cuts were greeted with outrage because at that point, even then, unions were strong enough to resist that sort of thing. Can you compare now your strongest stories, if you like, anecdotal stories, but also big stats, if you want, the situation now with the situation of peak equality in the 70s?
To explain the differences, the situation now is in a way like the 1920s in some ways, or 1930s, in a very high rate of inequality, but possibly beginning to come down. So if you take senior civil servants, since 2008, they've had a 25% real pay cut. Junior civil servants have had a 12% real pay cut. So actually can buy less food, can buy less clothes, can do things, but the gap between them is falling. So not everything is terrible now. The same in the 1920s. Inequalities were falling, but it felt really bad in the 30s. The difference by the late 1960s, early 1970s is if you didn't like your job, you told your boss to shove it and went to get another one, right? That's real freedom. And that means you can't treat workers really badly, not because of the unions, although they can be helpful, but because there are more jobs than there are people for men.
Right. So was that down to policy, Danny, or was that just a shortage of labour? You had a shortage of labour post-war, part of the reason we had to import labour. We have the same now, or at least some people would give you to believe that. And certainly after the pandemic, we seem to have quite a shortage of labour and a tight labour market. Shouldn't that shift the power balance back in favour of workers?
It was partly, it wasn't planned. It was partly a more equal society is more productive. It generates work by itself because when people have got money, they spend it. And that as it circulates, has a multiplier effect. We had remarkably few children in the 1930s, to such an extent that government wrote a paper worrying about us running out of people by the year 2000. Right? Fertility was unbelievably low in the 1930s, which means a lack of labour in the 1960s and 70s. Enoch Powell went to the Caribbean to ask people to come to be nurses in the health service, and to India to ask people to come and work night shifts on the mills. Enoch Powell went out and asked them. But that labour that came in wasn't quite enough, and so you got full employment. But also there's this sense that you shouldn't be treated in a certain way. You know, my home city of Oxford now, we used to have 40,000 car workers in the 70s. It was the majority of workers in the city were car workers. Most of them men, not all of them, most men, most married, most with kids. The city full of children. The houses that they had, these are 3-bed semis. Right? These houses now go for £500,000 to an academic who gets a car worker's house with 50 years of wear and tear on it. Right? You look back at it, was unbelievable what actually happened and what was possible.
And in your book, you describe your background, how you grew up around there, on the cheap side of the roundabout from the slightly more affluent houses.
Yeah.
But there wasn't that much difference between the university professors and the people who worked in the car industry.
Well, there was only one university professor anywhere near us. The university professors back then, Tolkien, they lived in North Oxford, and they had servants with white gloves. So the university professors were a bit, but that was a different. The university was this tiny thing in the centre of town that was scared. The university students were scared because you had 40,000 car workers and they all had children, right? So most teenagers in the city were the children of car workers. So you don't go out in the middle of Oxford wearing your frock coat because you're going to get hit. And the difference now, all that's gone. There are still 3,000 car workers. The most productive thing in the city of Oxford is still the car plant, but the profit goes to BMW in Germany. Produces an electric Mini every 1 minute and 2 seconds. Far more profitable than the production of an overseas student. But those 3,000 car workers largely don't have children. And we're now a one industry city, a university which also controls the hospitals. So it's if you imagine a kind of Durham pit village suddenly switching over to something else. And that's what's happened in this little city of Oxford. It was a car city, which is now an elite international university city.
And that change over time, Danny, creates generational inequalities, doesn't it? Yeah. And you've documented these too, but you can describe the housing market. I remember when I was a kid in the 70s, people chattering about it excitedly of the older generation about how much money they'd made because house prices were going right up.
Yeah.
I remember thinking naively, couldn't they come down again? And someone instructing me that, well, so long as earnings went up, prices could go up and people could afford them. But for one reason or another, it hasn't worked like that. House prices have gone up far faster than earnings and therefore become much, much less affordable. Now, the analysis of the housing market and how it contributes to inequality is often very shallow, isn't it? Yeah. It says the real cause is we're not building enough properties and doesn't look that much about credit creation. One thing that changed in 1971, banks were allowed to lend mortgages. Before then, you had to queue for a mortgage until the building society had enough savings to lend it out. That acted as a constraint on demand because you couldn't get a mortgage. It did mean that fewer people owned their home, but it meant that prices weren't pushed up by the weight of credit coming at it. But what we've seen since then is continual further deregulations of credit culminating in the securitization of lending so that you're actually paying your mortgage to some hedge fund in Singapore in the noughties collecting your repayments. This financialization has had a massive effect on
it. Has, although the number of people who can actually get a mortgage has been dropping, except for buy-to-let landlords.
Yes.
So
just recently, because it's so unaffordable, but before then, there was a sort of an attempt to bend over backwards, governments subsidizing house prices effectively through things like Help to Buy.
Yeah. And if you remember, and there are particular moments, 89, when we got rid of double mortgage interest tax relief, and there was people desperately going out to buy houses with their partner because it took 2 salaries by then to get a house, and houses shooting up, and then we had that little crash, 89, 90, 91, 92, and then up again, and all sold on a dream that you and your partner are going to stay together for 25 years and pay this mortgage off, which didn't happen. You've got to remember, half of all families split up and divorced. So people didn't end up very often actually owning these houses. that generation who managed to do it for 25 years earlier, that was the 1950s, 60s, 70s generation. So it's a terrible mess. The other thing on the analysis that really annoys me is people count the building of dwellings. They don't actually look at the building of rooms. And we measure every 10 years, we measure how many rooms there are. And we do enormous amounts of building extensions. A lot of our building, including at one point, one census discovered, I think it might have been the 1991 census, discovered an entire London borough had been built in London that wasn't actually documented, which may seem unbelievable to you. But the point I'm trying to get to is, every census we discovered we built so many flats, apartments, houses, and particularly extensions to houses, that the number of rooms per person has gone up every decade. We have more housing than ever before. We have more housing in London per person than ever before. We have more empty bedrooms than ever before.
But that's it. It's horribly misdistributed, isn't
Yeah.
it? So you have lots of members of the older generation who've paid off their mortgage and are under-occupying, rattling around in big 5-bed houses, while their kids are having kids now and can only afford a flat.
Yep, and the house is their pension or their insurance. The most efficient form of housing used to be council housing because you allocated it on the amount of space you need. We went from a family of 4, mum, dad, 2 kids living in a maisonette, to them right to buy. They sell the maisonette to a landlord. The landlord advertises it to whoever will pay the highest rent, and a single young professional rents that maisonette. And the irony is, the single young professional is really pissed off that they can only afford to rent a maisonette on the next council estate with no ball game signs, with no children anymore to play football. I mean, it was that particular move. I'm not against right to buy, by the way, but that particular move was one of the fastest ways to use housing less efficiently. And then the idea of the second house, or not an accidental second home. And it's easily done. It's all about relationships. It is easily done. I don't have one, but it's easily done. You could meet somebody today at lunch, right? You know, you like them here, you chat with them, you get together. A year from now, you decide to move into either your place or their place. What do you do in the other place? You rent it out occasionally. But for a lot of time, it's empty. Right? We've had a huge increase in these accidental second homes. And then, you know, wouldn't it be nice to buy somewhere on the coast just to use at weekends? Right? All that kind of thing. And it's amazing the excuses that people have for why they own a second or a third or a fourth. But we've allowed that. And it's simple to stop it. You simply tax people at a very high rate so that if they want to own 2 or 3 houses, and particularly large ones, they can, but they have to give up everything else in their life to pay the tax for the privilege to do that. My extreme version of this is Norman Tebbit, when he was in the House of Lords, complaining that his chauffeur was having to drive him such a long distance at night back from the Lords, past all these flats in London with no lights on. And Norman Tebbit asked what had gone wrong, right? And he was a minister in the government that did it, which shows it's not conspiracy. Norman Tebbit never meant this to happen. When they did right to buy, and what they're trying to do is create a bigger private sector. The private rental sector used to just be students and young professionals, right? And they wanted a bigger one because they thought it would be good for the market. They never meant to get a situation where 1 in 3 children in England lives in private rented now, can be evicted with 2 months' notice, lose all their friends because they have to move school, go into B&B. 1 in 3. The Tories never meant private rented to become the tenure with children, right? There's a lot of cock-up and callousness as well.
And also, I think the story of owning your own home and therefore getting on the housing ladder being aspirational and something that can be offered to working class people who haven't had that before is told in a very shallow way, isn't it? So you have people being told, well, if your house doubles in value, then you'll be able to go further up the ladder. But when you think about it, that's not true. So if you have a flat you buy for 50 grand, and you have a family home nearby that you might want to buy for 100 grand, house prices double. Well, you've made 50 grand, but the price of the place you'd next want to buy has gone up by 100 grand. Therefore, the next step in the ladder is further apart, the next rung up. House price rises penalise anybody whose next move in the housing market is up, and benefit only those whose next move in the housing market is to downsize. And that's landlords and older folk, not young people.
Yeah, it doesn't work. What should have been said is, if you like doing DIY, if you like getting on a ladder, if you like going up on the roof, if you like fiddling with the boiler, then you ought to. It's worth your while owning your house, if you like doing that. If you don't like doing that, it makes sense to be a tenant. I would like to be a tenant because I'm not very good at it. I try and do these things. I'm not very good at it. But I need security of tenure. I need to be a tenant like a tenant in Germany, where they have to pay me out. If I pay my rent, I can stay forever. And that's how we should do renting or owning. Don't say people can't own, but if you own, you're going to have a liability of actually looking after this property, and it's not going to make you money because you can only make money out of other people. All that money does is give you the right to other people's time and labour. So if you make some of it, somebody else has lost out in some way.
Now, some people would say some progress has been made on the inequality in the housing market, in the sense that at least both Conservatives and Labour seem to have accepted no-fault evictions, for example, should
but they haven't
disappear.
Yeah,
well,
they need to do it.
They say they reform.
Oh, but Ed Miliband said, I do suspect that this current government will do a few things, not least so that they can have happier dinner parties in London where they've got something to say. I think they will get rid of the 2-child limit on benefits at some point. And I think they might do the no fault eviction. But you can come up with a fault. As a landlord, you can claim they've done something. I once rented in Newcastle as a student, and the landlord wanted us out, and we said no because we still had 6 months on a tenancy. And I came back one day and he'd taken the roof off. He'd taken the roof off. And he went, it was dangerous. So we had to leave. Right? I mean, this is a long time ago. The only way to deal with landlords is to give tenants the absolute right to stay while they pay their rent. You have to offer them a sum of money, and if the tenant isn't willing to take it, they can carry on staying. The tenant has to have the right to sue you. You have to. None of us are qualified. Well, maybe some of you are, but none of us are qualified to run a school. It's a difficult thing running a school. It's a difficult thing to be a teacher. None of us are qualified to run a hospital. None of us are qualified to actually be in charge of somebody else's home. The idea that it's okay to have private landlords, that somebody amateur can do something as important as provide somebody else's shelter, is just ridiculous. And most of the rest of Europe has better systems in place. If you want to rent your property in other European cities, you're told by regulation the amount you can charge depending on the square feet of it and how you can treat the people who you are responsible for, who are living in your house, and you're not going to make much money out of it. And this is just basic decency, and we've lost that.
Has income inequality really got worse, though? I mean, there have been studies, for example, by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Even people like Thomas Piketty, who's on the left, appear to think that it's not income inequalities so much anymore. It's wealth inequalities that really count, partly because of the housing market and assets being overwhelmingly in the hands of the older generation. They increased benefits by more than inflation in the coalition government. They increased tax thresholds, so less of your pay was taxed for a long time to improve things. That was arguably a progressive measure. Is it really income inequality now?
I'd say it still is, although I think income inequality has possibly been falling in the last 3 or 4 years for the first time since 1918. So I think something really exciting is going on. Conservative Chancellor after Conservative Chancellor would stand up at every budget and say income inequality has fallen. And what they were doing was they were taking a measure, which is the ratio of the median, bear with me, the ratio of the median of the top quintile to the median of the bottom quintile of the income distribution. And that did fall since the 1990s. It ignores the poorest 10% and ignores the richest 10%. The richest 10% take 40% of everything. You include them, and that inequality carried on rising. You look at the 1%, and it carries on rising until 2 or 3 years ago. Why I think income inequality matters more at a very basic level is it correlates so much better with things going wrong in societies than wealth inequality. If you have low income inequality, you sort out other things in your society, including controlling the rich. They may have high wealth, but they're not allowed to do things with their wealth. Than in countries where they have higher wealth inequality. The classic are Scandinavian countries with high wealth inequality, where you might own the land, but everybody has the right to walk over it, to pick mushrooms and fruit on it, and you have the duty to make it safe, right? So what is that wealth if actually it's a liability? What I think happens in some of the most equal countries in Europe is a quiet agreement between the left and the right. And the quiet agreement is that the left will leave the rich with their wealth, their houses. It won't try to reduce the wealth of housing in Helsinki or Stockholm or Oslo. But the wealthy will not interfere with the programs of the left. It will not interfere with health and education and so on. Why do the wealthy want their homes in the central cities of these Nordic countries to be worth a lot? Because they want to be able to flee if things go badly wrong. If you're very wealthy, always in the back of your head is something can go wrong. The Russians could invade, There could be a revolution. Somebody could try and get rid of my property rights. You're thinking about going to another country. This is a luxury. It's a luxury I don't have. I'm pretty well off, but I've got one house, one passport. But people who are really well off are scared because of what they've got to lose. And part of being scared is wanting to be able to exit. And so you can have high wealth inequality, but as long as the wealth, I'd rather not have it, but it's just a reality that wealth inequality doesn't correlate well with problems in the rest of society.
Okay, great. Now, we're at a conference called Scotonomics. You're a geographer. I'd like to ask you about geographical inequalities. And I don't know if you've tried to map those on electoral outcomes. Can you tell us to what extent your work has informed an idea of how neglect of inequality is an issue, and neglect of the poor has led to Brexit, Trump, etc.?
Other people, like you could do. I was involved in a book called The Spirit Level, and I got to read it before it was published in 2010. So you could do lots and lots of correlations of inequality with other things. It doesn't always mean that one causes the other. There's often an intervening factor. But with elections, the strongest correlation is with apathy. So the higher your inequality, the fewer people vote on average. 50% of people don't vote in the US, even when the stakes are this high. The more equal countries, more people vote. A few exceptions like Australia where you have to. As inequality rises and falls very, very vaguely, if we had 20 planet Earths, I could be so much more confident. You're only talking 4 or 5 dozen countries, so these graphs up there. The other thing that happens in more unequal countries is the vote for the far right is higher. As soon as you classify the Conservative Party as far right, that all makes sense. The 2 countries in Europe which misbehaved were France, where the far right vote was too high given their degree of equality, and Germany, where it was too low. Now, far right voting in Germany was low for particularly historical reasons, which appear to be going now. In France, it actually went down again. So they do line up. More equal countries have a healthier politics. All the political parties in more equal countries move towards the left. Take Germany. Merkel's policies, I would say, were to the left of Corbyn. When you actually look at what they do in Germany, Angela Merkel's public spending was higher than the 2017 and 2019 manifesto for Labour promised. Her attitude to a number of migrants from war-torn countries, who she actually let in, was. it seems very strange to say that a conservative German politician can be to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, but all of our politics moved far, far, far to the right as we became more unequal. And earlier, all of our politics moved to the left. So the Tory party beat Labour in building more council houses in the 50s than Labour had managed to do in the 40s. That your political parties tend to be incredibly close to each other. They think they're very different, but the status, what's accepted is narrow. And what you need is for it to begin to move in a progressive direction, often led by left and green parties, but they drag behind them the other parties. And it's these things that I think matter more than who actually wins elections.
Thanks, Danny. I'll invite your questions and comments, but before we do that, I just want to offer one little challenge, which is we are now seeing real incomes rising after they were falling post-pandemic, and they've fallen for most of the last 20 years, but they are rising. There was a more than 3% rise in real incomes in the most recent stats. That's the best since 2002, I'm told, by the ONS.
Yeah.
So can we not just hope that things might return to normal after an aberrant period pre and post financial crisis, where things like super low interest rates created an abnormal situation where productivity wasn't improving and real wages weren't improving? Can we hope that things might get back to the sort of post-war norm?
We don't know. It's very easy for people. It's very easy for all of us to think we know what's going to happen. And what you've got to do is just try and take yourself back in your mind to where you were in the year 2000 or 2010 and what you thought would happen. And then the easy way to know you can't know is because we've had a turbulent time. The last few years in the UK have seen a narrowing of income inequalities between various groups. They have seen house prices in real terms actually fall. We don't report that, but inflation's been higher than house price rises. That's quite a shock. The house prices, by the way, you remember that there was a rise during the pandemic, right? And there was a flood of people to the countryside. And this happened everywhere apart from China in the rich world. Now, sadly, what actually happened was there weren't lots of empty houses in the countryside. What happened is there are quite a lot of very old people in the countryside. The pandemic killed 15% of all our men over 90 and 10% of all women. It created empty homes in the countryside, which affluent middle-class people moved to, often 10 years earlier than they would have done, for a higher price. And so you get what looks like a housing boom. And that's partly with the pandemic upsets every single social series. You know, it was the most traumatic effect since the Second World War, and it's in there. And I mention it because trying to work out exactly what's going on now, you do have these very, very strange years, and almost like a post-war thing. We don't like talking about it. You all kind of went a bit hushed, like don't mention the pandemic. But that makes it hard. We could be at the beginning of a turnaround. The really sensible statistical thing to say is that things are going to get better because, give or take Bulgaria, we are the very worst. Odds on we will not be. In 1977, Peter Townsend identified 10 areas of the country that were doing worse and needed government intervention.
You don't mean the lead singer of the Who?
No. Peter Townsend, the sociologist.
Or guitarist, I should say.
Yeah. And the incoming Conservative government completely ignored his report and the Black Report and did nothing. 5 of those 10 areas got much better with no intervention. Because if you pick the very worst 10 areas, there will be temporary reasons why they are so bad. Similarly, the situation in the UK is so unbelievably appalling. There's only about 5 Eastern European countries where babies die at a faster rate now than the UK. The average person in the poorest fifth in Eastern Europe is better off than the average person in the poorest fifth here and so on. The situation is so bad in the UK that odds on it'll actually begin to climb up the ranks because it takes quite a lot of effort to keep it this bad. But I'm more optimistic we're doing more than that. Because we've done things like the rest of Europe hasn't. 65% of our young people go to university by the time they're 30. 65%, the highest rate in Europe. And we've landed onto them a debt, the biggest debt, bigger than the average American student debt. Right? And this is our entire middle class. And then we think they're going to buy our homes when we want to retire, having taken out of their paycheck every month, whatever it is, 9% on top of, we are, a lot of things are built in to mean we're going to have to become more equal, because it's really expensive to be unequal. It's actually very, very hard work to achieve this.
And we know that you get better growth if you have a more equal economy rather than less one. Can I invite anyone to chip in if they have any thoughts on what we've been talking about?
Do you think that austerity is a mechanism?
I need a mic. The mic's here, so I'll bring the mic over to that lady.
Okay.
This gentleman has his hand up first.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Danny, do you think that the narrative around growth is directly, in this period, directly in opposition to the narrative about reducing inequality? My belief is that's my belief anyway. And if you were to believe that, how would you address the dominance of the growth sort of imperative within mainstream culture?
Okay. I'll do that one quickly while you bring the mic round. Growth been dropping since the 1950s, just worldwide. GDP per capita drops. China's on 6% at the moment. I suspect that everybody says that the Chinese statistics lie. I suspect they lie the other way, and it's actually a bit higher, but they don't want to make us feel bad. But anyway, growth becomes harder and harder, not least because we're having fewer children. Too long question. We're working our way out of growth. You look at Japan and 2 lost decades, and actually they still have the highest life expectancy in the world. In the very short term, though, we do need to pay for food and medicines. And the things that were growth industries in Britain were universities, overseas students, casino banking, which I wouldn't rely on, but that's one of the reasons we left the EU, is that we escape EU banking regulation. And the thing we're the world leader in, bigger than the USA, is online gambling. And the tragedy is that in the very short term, simply to pay our way, because we have to do something that means that people from the rest of the world send money to us if we're going to get the things that we absolutely have to have for the rest of the world. So I worry about the short term. I genuinely do. My father lives on the west of Wales. Since Brexit, the number of cans of goods that never make it to the co-op on the far west of Wales is shocking. One of my family needs an inhaler for asthma. The ability of our pharmacy to get an asthma inhaler. There's some very, very basic things that are tricky. So theoretically, yes, but in the short term, for a shattered country in a precarious position, and the only member of the G7 that doesn't make its own steel anymore, which is why we don't care about tariffs. The narrative is burnt out. The narratives. There's a clip. If you want to see me almost hit somebody on telly, then Google Danny Dorling, Matt Hancock, 2015 Newsnight. Matt Hancock was the chief secretary to the Treasury and was sent out by Osborne, because Osborne had announced that by the year 2030, the UK will become the richest country on earth, large, i.e. not compared to tiny oil states, GDP per capita, if we follow George Osborne's economic plan. Right? And George, I think he believed it. And then in his resignation speech, Boris Johnson did the same thing, stick with the plan, the Sunny Uplands. And then Keir does it in a series of speeches with another slightly altered target. And it's just so very stale. It's almost a mark of failure that you do this. So I think that luckily that particular narrative has died. But there are cities like mine in Oxford and Durham and probably Dundee, and certainly Sheffield and Newcastle and Manchester, where the main industry, where there used to be cotton or whatever, is a university. And simply to be able to heat people's houses and get into the food, we need these universities to keep running. Sheffield University and Sheffield Hallam. These are the major industries of Sheffield. The income from the overseas students, for $250 million a year, is larger than the income made by the metal industry of South Yorkshire. And if you think that's an unfair comparison, there's no metal industry left. The metal industry of South Yorkshire is a euphemism. Another one was cutlery. The metal industry of South Yorkshire is arms. It's titanium shells, it's alive and kicking, it's Rolls-Royce, it's there. Not nice, that's most of what it does. But those two universities bring in more money from overseas than all the disreputable arms trading of the area.
Exports, gambling, banking, etc.
Universities are better than gambling and banking.
Yeah.
That'd be my argument
Thank
for
you,
them.
Danny.
Yeah.
This lady's been waiting patiently.
Do you think austerity is a mechanism to create inequality, to create apathy, to leave a clear path for the oligarchs, corporate bosses, asset managers to have their wicked getting richer way?
Yeah, do I think austerity is a clear path for the oligarchs to have their wicked way?
Well, do you think it's a mechanism?
Is it mechanism?
In order to create
Yes.
inequality, which creates apathy, in order that the rich can
Yeah,
get richer.
in order the rich can get richer. The particular...
An online audience.
Yeah, so we get the online audience and get it too. There are different, very quickly, there are very different periods of austerity. There's 1921, there's austerity under fascism in Italy in the 30s and so on. We had what I think was quite a good austerity in the Second World War, where we brought in rationing, which lasted all the way. We had austerity till 1952, but that was largely austerity for the rich, because the rations for most children meant they never ate as well as during rationing, right? So you can actually have good austerity, which we had from 1939 to 1952. The austerity that came in 2010 wasn't particularly well planned. That was George Osborne. But he doesn't like normal people. I mean, George brought in the two-child limit. Vindictive, eugenicist, nasty, verging on evil. The mechanism in 210 was the Star Chamber, if you remember that. If as a minister you could cut more than other ministers, you could join the special Star Chamber of special ministers. So that was how it was done. You're seeing a really fast attempt at a night watchman state occur currently in the US. So,
What do you mean by a night watchman state?
Where the only thing that's left is a man going round with a light, because you cut everything else that the state does. So you cut the Department of Education because you don't need a federal Department of Education, because schools are just something you do locally. Charities, whatever, it doesn't matter. A night watchman state is the state is only responsible for security. The army, monopoly of violence, the police. So we're seeing in the States somebody playing their fancy out of trying to do that. Osborne, as Chancellor, wasn't as far as that, but he didn't like most people, didn't trust them, and certainly wasn't going to have him and his families and his people having to pay for what he thought was Labour's fault. The banking crisis happened under Labour. So it's not nice. The person who is continuous in this is David Freud, who was then made a member of the Lords. David Freud was the advisor to Mandelson. When the government changed in 2010, he stays in power. He does the first cuts to benefits and so on. If you want to look at a mechanism, it's David Freud, Freud. And the thinking, he was somebody who made so much money in banking, he could retire early. He fancied doing something else. And this was the something else he did. So there is your direct person. And you've got to think, what is it that motivated him? And there's other men. And at the end, made Sarah Tever resign.
Okay. Yeah. Danny, I'm just keen to see if anybody else wants to chip in We've got 3 hands there.
Thanks very much. I've got a couple of points on housing. There's been quite a lot of talk about housing, and I think the main beneficiary of constantly rising house prices are the banks, because and you've got a limited stock of housing and you've got all that asset price inflation. They're basically sucking more of their income to pay for the housing. So does that act as a suppressant on overall aggregate demand and actually make us all poorer? Because gains in property prices, if you need somewhere to live, it's a notional gain. The second housing point was wanting to make, in the 70s, 80% of your housing budget went on building houses and 20% went on housing benefit. That has now flipped, and a lot of that can be attributed, I think, to Thatcher's policy on right to buy. So now a lot of the money in the housing budget just finds its way into the pockets of private landlords. I think the third point that I'd like to make is we've heard a lot about Awaab's law, which is basically legislating to give tenants better rights in terms of damp and mould and condition of houses. But that only applies to the regulated social sector, and the private sector is exempt.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be completely wrong.
Yeah.
Danny?
Yeah, all good points. I agree. We've got to get the private sector down. The private landlords are, in very rare cases, a private landlord does take a sledgehammer to their house. I've heard it going once, in kind of anger, or bulldoze it. But in general, if it becomes uneconomic to be a private landlord, you sell it and somebody buys it as a family house. Or, in the past, the state can buy at rock bottom prices and you nationalise. But we've got to see being a private landlord as something which is morally reprehensible. Right? You've got to actually paint it in that. It is, if I imagine, I'm sitting here now talking to you. Imagine that I had kept a house in Sheffield and there are some people living in my house and paying me rent, probably at twice what the mortgage would be, which is going to pay for my nice holiday in Tuscany this year, which I can't have because I'm not a private landlord. Right? And they're in my house in Sheffield. It's a bit damp. But I'm not going to sort it out because I want to talk to you lot. Right? Being a private landlord is a morally reprehensible thing to do unless you've been on some amazing set of training courses on how to get damp out of houses and you go around all the time trying to fix it for them and caring for your tenants as much as you care for yourself. Otherwise, you shouldn't be a landlord. Really. None of you would be allowed to set up a school. It's illegal, right? You can't do it and invite a load of kids in to teach them, right? The police will be round, right? We don't let the idea that an amateur can do this is just wrong. And we've got to start saying that and partly shame people and partly shame politicians into dealing with this. 1 in 3 children lives in a home where they can receive a letter tomorrow, their parents, telling them they're out. When I was a child, almost every child in Britain had complete security of tenure. Right?
And rents have gone up by 15% over the past year, I think it was, wasn't it? Another contribution there, please.
Isn't part of the reason for housing prices that the very disproportionate relative value of land to the building compared with the rest of Europe, which leads to things like land banking and homes that built to last 30 years and then fall down? How do we stop that?
Yeah, and it's often been proposed, Danny, as a solution that you could tax land and that it's very lightly taxed in this country, and that's one of the causes of inequality. How do you respond to that?
You can tax land. You can have a proper progressive property tax. You can, in the most expensive areas, mine. You can look at this little bit of scrub around the edge next to John Radcliffe Hospital, the biggest hospital in Europe, and you could say that little bit of scrub could have some houses for nurses on it, and never use the word greenbelt to describe that bit of scrub again, which is within 200 metres of a hospital. Okay? So partly land values are kept so very high by people with a vested interest to keep them high, but also I think the government are getting rid of hope value. That was last week's announcement. There's a new town commission. The new towns commission is chaired by, I think it's Michael Lyons and Kate Barker. Normally these two would only agree to chair one thing on their own because they're heavy hitters. The fact that these two have agreed to chair the new towns commission suggests that we're actually going to get some new towns. But the question is where and how. My preference is around train stations or around old medieval cities like Oxford. And you use new towns power and you build new town housing, which is a posher word for council housing. But you do it in a different way. You do it green, you do it without cars, and have some aspiration. And Angela Rayner, she's supposed to be in charge of the housing policy. If you don't give people anything you can point to within the next 2 or 3 years, you're in deep, deep trouble. You know, a new level of apathy is going to be reached in this country.
Danny,
So-
we're just running out of time
Sorry.
here. I'm conscious of some other people getting. Can we do some?
12:15. We've got 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So
Just one
quite
microphone.
quick questions and snappy answers, please. Go ahead.
Okay, go for this lady here.
Oh,
You pass that along?
Can you tell me a bit about whether you think globalisation has played a role within inequalities in the UK?
Whether globalisation has played a role in inequalities. I think the UK there's a lot more to do with the fact that we were the richest place on earth 120 years ago. And so we're at the heart of a particular globalisation, and that empire went. And it's trickler. Worldwide, globalisation has resulted in an equalisation of incomes, apart from at the extremes, because of the rise of China. You know, and we keep on not saying this, but the rise of China, the movement of 1 billion people from being some of the poorest on earth to being a global middle class, is an incredible thing to have occurred. So globalization isn't necessarily all bad. Before the First World War, we may have even had more trade going internationally as a proportion of goods than we have now. So I wouldn't worry about it. We just need to get on with each other globally better and work out, do we really need to ship things quite this distance?
thanks, Danny. I just want to get another couple in if we can. Over here, please.
Let's go around.
Try to remember it. Have you done any consideration of taxing income derived from wealth,
Yeah.
such as taxing rents that a landlord receives? And where would you start with a narrative to
Where do I start now?
popular discussion
on it?
I've seen some effective work on wealth tax as a general concept.
Where I'd start, I've analysed once the Swedish tax record. For Sweden, you can get everybody's tax, how much they pay, and how much of that is the tax on their interest from their wealth. And the way I might do it, or I've got to be subtle, is for people under 30. Are you under 30? Okay. For your age group, the group who actually die the most in Sweden are those who receive the highest income from wealth. They're trust fund kids in Sweden. So wealth is actually bad for you. And the causes of death are small airplane crashes, drug overdoses, skiing, extreme sports. But seriously, it's quite a shock to look at the Swedish tax data and realise that income from wealth is actually a liability under the age of 30 because it allows you to do dangerous things, and because Sweden's so much more equal that poorer Swedes are not dying so much from poverty as here. Now, okay, maybe an argument I'd use here. The argument I'd use more widely about wealth taxation is I'd say, do you have the campaign up here about the farmers saying how terrible it is? And they put big, you don't get that? Okay, in England, there are loads of huge posters outside farms going death tax, because you know that the government have introduced, okay? And they can't believe this, that some very rich farmers are going to have to pay inheritance tax, and that the farm isn't going to be given to the son, whose only qualification to farm it is being genetically related to the farmer, right? What I do is I'd say, I feel your pain. This is really bad. I put maybe 4 Union Jacks behind me and go, I need some Union Jacks. And say, it's really unfair. It's really unfair that you rich farmers are going to have to pay this inheritance tax. Let's make sure that everybody else as rich as you does as well. And do it patriotically for Britain. And this is a patriotic British thing. But again, that's dangerous. It's dangerous to do it that way. But the wealthy are not happy people.
Let's leave it on that thought for that
yeah.
question. Sorry, because I just want to get
Yeah.
one more. I know you've been waiting to come in.
Yeah.
This will be the last question.
Changing things slightly, as a geographer, have you done much work on populations, changes in population from 1800 to today, and then through to 2100? There was a recent thing in the Guardian that suggested that without immigration, population in Scotland would halve.
Yeah. So my next book's called The Next Crisis, which comes out in May. So I do want the book, but it has a little bit. The book I'm supposed to be writing now, Brett will know this feeling of when the book I'm supposed to be writing, I've got to deliver by September, which comes out in September next year, is called When Population Falls. So I'm currently working on trying to work out guesses. What isn't a guess is we know that in 2024, the lowest number of babies for many decades was born. We know the maximum number of people are going to be aged 76 in the year 2100. It's baked in, unless humans arrive from another planet. We are looking at population falls for the first time in the history of our species.
Okay.
Right, and it's an incredible and really, really positive thing. It's happening because women have got power, and it's really good news.
Thanks very much, Danny. Thank you all. Please thank Danny. I think we're back here at 2:00.